It's really good to be here with you this afternoon, and we're all shaped to some degree by our childhood environments and experiences, sometimes quite literally and not always for the best. And that's why there are child safeguarding principles and practices to guarantee every child a minimum standard of care and protection from significant harm. And sadly, some children still fall through the net, and when they do, child safeguarding professionals can be called to account and sometimes disciplined for failure to protect children adequately. In the more serious cases, society engages in a form of hand-wringing, repeating the phrase, "never again," again and again and again, in variations on a theme. An analysis of serious case reviews identified the main lesson that's not being learnt: the need to maintain a focus on the child. Instead, there can be a tendency to lose balance and focus more on the needs of parents. I will argue today that ritual genital cutting of children in the UK is a singular example of a major safeguarding concern that ducks and weaves through the usual ethical principles and guidance, ultimately taking eyes off the child and losing sight of the child. But it's not surprising that the safeguarding lesson is not being learnt, because whilst it's been ruled illegal even for an adult to consent to wounding of their own penile foreskin, in stark contrast, the removal of the same body part from children not yet able to consent, dissent or to protect themselves is largely invisible to regulatory bodies. This disparity affecting tens of thousands of UK children annually is counterintuitive, and those who do report harm, their own or others, are widely dismissed, or at best their arguments are balanced against those with an earnest desire to perpetrate traditional genital cutting procedures on children in the name of their faith or culture. Ordinarily, the same protective standards apply to every single child, regardless of their home environment, the family's social status, or the culture or community in which they're raised. In principle, there are no special privileges. Deliberate child harm may lead to prosecutions. In Wales, where I work as a GP, it's illegal to smack a child. And yet, a jaundiced, if not blind eye is turned to the plight of this unique subset of children. So the obvious question is, why are child safeguarding professionals and the UK medical profession not united in protecting children from all forms of forced genital cutting? And that's the subject of my recent paper, which forms the backdrop to what I'll be talking about today. And thanks to the National Secular Society, the paper is free to access and widely available. And I'm the medical lead for the Special Expertise Network of the National Secular Society. And my paper approaches the topic from an insider's perspective on two fronts. Firstly, I'm the safeguarding lead partner for my GP practice, and formerly the GP representative on the Powys Local Safeguarding Children Board, the statutory body with overall child safeguarding responsibilities for the county. Until earlier this year, I had been for 15 years a representative of the British Medical Association, the BMA, which is the main UK doctors' professional body and trade union, and I still chair the Shropshire division of the BMA. And secondly, I'm an insider because I was born into a religious cutting community, many of whose beliefs and practices I've never shared as an adult. And over the years, I've largely tried to keep my personal anecdotal perspective, however relevant, out of the debate. And instead, I've focused on the powerful standalone sort of ethical, medical and safeguarding arguments supporting the premise that no child should ever be subjected to ritual genital cutting, period. But in doing so, I've been missing a trick. The obvious claim would be as an internal dissenter, a voice from within my childhood community. But that claim is not mine to make, because I'm not still a part of my childhood community, and because there's a stronger argument still. So take a look at me, if you wouldn't mind, for a minute or less, and what do you see? Yeah, you might have guessed. My parents were Orthodox Jews. I had a bar mitzvah. I studied Hebrew, classical and modern, and I'm not Jewish. So bear with me. Let's go back a couple of months to a political party conference I attended as a member. Previous internal party discussions about ritual circumcision were largely met with supportive comments, so it was time to step up a gear. I wandered over for a friendly chat to the Jewish stall at the conference. What could possibly go wrong? I approached the stall with some trepidation and with an open mind. I've previously spoken to many of my relatives and long-standing Jewish friends about circumcision, some of whom still speak to me. No joke, and have debated circumcision regularly, including against senior members of the UK and international Jewish community. And also 2 years ago, one of my co-authors on an earlier paper on the same subject was a Jewish woman committed to protecting members of her community from this harmful practice. So a pretty mixed bag of interactions. So at the stall, I was told what I'm usually told by Jewish people when I mention my background. If your mother was Jewish, you're Jewish. How does that work, I asked, if I want to be Buddhist or Muslim or non-believer? Oh, that's okay, they said, you're culturally Jewish. How does that work, I asked, if I don't follow any of the cultures or traditions of the Jewish religion? Oh, that's okay. You're genetically Jewish. But how does that work, I asked, if someone else wants to convert to Judaism? Are they then less Jewish than I am, who doesn't even claim to be Jewish? They kept trying, though. It seemed important to them that I somehow still belonged to the Jewish community. You're ethnically Jewish, then. Ultimately, I was challenging the idea that someone else gets to decide how a person defines themselves in the context of a religious organisation. And I've never hidden my Jewish heritage. Underpinning the basic human right of freedom of religion or belief is the right to define or redefine one's own religion or belief. And yet the bankrupt idea that children belong to their parents' faith community sustains and supports the mass collusion that children are necessarily of their parents' faith. And nowhere is this collusion seen more starkly than in the context of the Jewish practice of Brit Milah, the excruciatingly painful, irreversible ritual cutting of the penis of an 8-day-old baby, usually in a surgically inappropriate environment, assigning his genitals according to his parents' faith markers to give him the gift of fully belonging to the community of his birth. What would otherwise be inconceivable becomes widely accepted, with the argument going that it is of central importance to the Jewish people that the practice continues. So why is Brit Milah so important to Jewish people? Well, during my upbringing, I learned to understand that a bris, as I was brought up to call it, was physically simply the removal of an inconsequential flap of skin, which nevertheless was on a par of spiritual importance with Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and with marrying a fellow Jew. In terms of what it really means to be Jewish, even if you didn't always eat kosher food or keep the Sabbath day holy or even believe in a deity. But why? Well, Brit Milah is number 86 of 613 Jewish commandments. They're a mixed bunch. Don't take revenge or wrong people in speech. A rapist must marry his unwed victim. Homosexual sex is prohibited, and destroy the Canaanite people to the 7th generation and let none live. Ooh. You'll probably be pleased to learn that most modern Jewish authorities only keep about a third of these commandments in their original form. Commandment 86 seems to have high status and longevity. Ordinarily, it's widely accepted that children should be protected from making permanent, medically unnecessary bodily alterations or markings such as tattoos until they're adults, when they're hopefully less likely to regret the decision later. In England, children can't vote, and babies are self-evidently incapable of deciding whether they want to alter their body permanently in honour of their parents' religion. They would ordinarily be protected from serious harm, especially to their genitals. The statutory UK regulatory and licensing body for medical doctors is the General Medical Council, the GMC, which produces a wealth of ethical guidance that doctors must follow in order to maintain our licence to practice medicine. In 2012, the GMC issued specific guidance articulating the risk that in some cases it may be difficult to distinguish between parents sharing their religious beliefs and those harming their children. Safeguarding is integral to my job as a GP. All licensed doctors working with children have mandatory regular safeguarding training. We risk our licence if we fail to safeguard a child at risk of significant harm. There are degrees of harm. What counts as significant harm can be gleaned from the Children Act. Circumcision is not mentioned specifically, but it was mentioned, as Shirin said, by the then most senior judge of the Family Division of the High Court of England and Wales in a 2015 judgment. I could tell you more about that if you're interested, because it's a fascinating case. But Sir James Mumby stated, and it actually wasn't part of the original case, but he just stated that he was going to wade into deep water and that some forms of FGM are less harmful than male circumcision. And because FGM is technically always illegal, and there's another rabbit hole, and is always considered a significant harm, legally therefore, ritual circumcision, more harmful than some forms of FGM, is a significant harm too, he said. And yet he added that society is willing to accept it. So, for a significant harm to continue unchallenged, it would need to be considered to be overall in the best interests of the child. And this is indeed the argument leaned on by both the BMA and the GMC to justify their positions. In the most recent BMA circumcision guidance from 2019, and thank you for providing so much background information to that, which I'll return to also in a while, the phrase best interests appears over 50 times in that document. You might imagine that safeguarding would be part of that discussion, integral to it. But safeguarding is mentioned only once in the BMA guidance, and that in the context of FGM. And the best interests argument in this context is both out of place and ultimately without substance. In medicine, a best interest discussion is ordinarily used when a patient who's medically unwell needs to decide between treatment options in a time-sensitive manner, but who doesn't have the capacity to make that decision. Ritually circumcised children, on the other hand, are usually healthy, at least before the procedure, and the only time sensitivity is that defined by their parents' or carers' belief systems, given time and the child could decide for himself. And even then, in order to conclude that the child's best interests will be served by ritually cutting his genitals, it's first necessary to set aside the established code of practice for comparable surgery and to bypass standard safeguarding norms. Underlying this exceptionalism lies a fear, and it's a reasonable fear, that those of us with our eyes focused primarily on the child may be accused of being anti-Semitic. It's no idle fear. Soon I'll cover some of the arguments I've tried to share with the UK medical profession and some of the responses and justifications I've heard back, which have led me to understand that my simple statement that I'm not Jewish challenges the very core of the incoherent ethical justifications for the widespread ritual cutting of children's genitals. But first, let me tell you about Jonathan. And not the Jonathan in the room, I hasten to add. I first met Jonathan in Belfast in June 2012 in the Green Room, just before the BBC's Sunday Morning Live programme, where we were to be on opposite sides of the debate in the context of the recent Cologne ruling the previous month. "Are you Jewish?" he asked me when he first saw me. I smiled and gave him my usual answer. "No, my parents were, but I'm not." After the show, Jonathan suggested to me that we might debate again on the topic of circumcision. I took him up on his offer. So we next met in early 2013, when I'd been invited to debate circumcision at a London University college, and they'd asked me if I knew anyone suitable to put the pro-circumcision argument against me. Jonathan, obviously. And after our debate, and in answer to an audience question asking Jonathan for his thoughts about people trying to protect boys and girls, Jonathan stated, and I quote, "Lots of anti-circumcision campaigners came out of the woodwork, and two world rulers in modern times who sought to ban circumcision were Hitler and Stalin, so that's the company you're in if you seek to ban it." My published reportage about Jonathan invoking Hitler upset Jonathan a lot, apparently. He threatened repeatedly to sue me for libel. And Jonathan was not just any old opponent. He is a barrister and was by then the Vice President, soon to be the President, of the Board of Deputies, the main representative body of Jewish people in the UK. Had it gone to court, I may well have won the case, largely because his words are still available to listen to online. But perhaps winning wasn't the point of his threats. Win or lose, the financial cost of a libel case may have cost me my house. So what to do? I amended my article to include only verbatim quotes, removing any interpretation, so that any damage to his reputation might come only from Jonathan's own mouth. And Hitler didn't like circumcision, but he didn't try to protect children from it. He murdered people like me, children of Jewish parents or grandparents. And child protection advocates are not interested in preventing adults from expressing their faith, just preventing the imposition of harmful faith-based practices on defenceless children. My last meeting with Jonathan was in 2018 on BBC's Newsnight, discussing Icelandic proposals to extend protections to boys. Curiously, Jonathan seemed not to know me, and soon told Emily Maitlis, "I've never met a Jewish man opposed to circumcision." and this was a light bulb moment for me. To those of us familiar with the scientific method, confirmation bias is to favour information that confirms or supports one's existing expectations or beliefs. Jonathan's comment was a textbook example, seeing only those who agree with him. Jonathan helped me to realise that to many genital cutting enthusiasts, people whose genitals they cut in the name of their religion and yet who do not align with that religion are invisible to them. And those who try to protect such children are apparently coming out of the woodwork. An offensive term I wouldn't dream of using on Jonathan Arkush, who is now co-chair of the Jewish circumcision advocacy organisation Mila UK. So as we now turn our attention to the medical profession, I ask you just to bear in mind some of the pressures, actual and perceived, that might have been brought to bear on medical regulatory authorities in the context of their extraordinary approach to child safeguarding. So there are no mainstream scholars or medical organisations in the world recommending childhood circumcision for medical reasons. Nevertheless, some childhood circumcision advocates claim possible benefits, even whilst the harms, risks and ethics may be less favourable. Yet even the strongest of those don't claim that childhood circumcision is medically necessary. The necessity argument rests only on religious or cultural claims. So how are doctors normally guided to manage medical procedures on children that are not medically necessary? Let's take a look now at some advice on this from the GMC, the NHS and others. The GMC invokes the best interests argument. They also stipulate that the child or young person should be involved as much as possible in decisions, and that even though parents can consent if a child doesn't want a medically unnecessary procedure, it shouldn't take place. Doctors are further reminded to consider a child or young person's vulnerabilities, make sure that any consent is truly voluntary, and that people are given enough time to make a decision. And the guidance specifically related to medically unnecessary surgery on children's genitals is sex-specific. The NHS states that cosmetic labiaplasty should not be done on girls under 18 because the labia continue to develop beyond puberty and into adulthood, whereas for boys, circumcision is a relatively simple procedure. And look at this. In response to concerns that children were nevertheless having cosmetic labial surgery, in 2013 the British Society for Paediatric and Adolescent Gynecology stated that postponing labiaplasty until adulthood is strongly recommended to help adolescents achieve a well-informed decision regarding an irreversible procedure with possible adverse aesthetic and functional outcomes. Quite. I don't need to spell out to you the hypocrisy and contradictions, do I? In 2008, I took the lead of what was then the Secular Medical Forum, a coalition of doctors trying to prevent harm to patients due to other people's beliefs. I soon found that most of my work related to religious bodies' obsessions with other people's bodies and with sex. My learning curve was steep. One of my first mistakes was to think the reasoned argument might prevail with the GMC, whose position then was, we do not have a position on ritual circumcision. Nevertheless, encouraged by hearing a senior GMC policy advisor speak on Radio 4 about just how important it was that religious beliefs didn't compromise other people's medical care, I asked to meet with her. She agreed, with the caveat that she didn't intend to change her mind on ritual circumcision. So in January 2010, I arrived at this meeting well armed with ethical guidance, which I thought she might find hard to ignore. I discussed the guidance to promote the protection of the vulnerable, to prevent harm, especially that caused by doctors ourselves, to do everything possible to let patients make up their own minds about important medical interventions, and for those without the capacity to make up their own minds, always to take the least restrictive option, including doing nothing, particularly if the patient might later gain or regain capacity. And this wasn't just any old ethical advice, this was the GMC's ethical advice that I took to my meeting with the GMC, who always advised doctors to make the care of the patient your first concern. And my request was modest. I asked her whether the GMC might consider removing just those 6 words, "We do not have a position on circumcision." Because had the GMC not chosen to make any statement about non-therapeutic circumcision, pro, against, neutral, then their usual guidance would apply at all times. With this misleading statement, the GMC actively guides doctors to exceptionalise ritual circumcision, the effect of which is to permit a practice that children would otherwise be protected from. My meeting didn't go so well. Apparently the GMC agreed with all its own advice, which was just as well, but the trump card was that I had no idea how offended the chief rabbi would be, I was told. I sort of did. I was just, dare I say it, trying to bring forward that never again hand-wringing safeguarding moment when the GMC finally catches on that children's most basic rights to be nurtured and protected are being obscured by the imposing presence and views of the chief rabbi and his acolytes, GMC eyes firmly fixed away from the child. Roll forward a few years, and in January 2019, the GMC put out for consultation its draft updated guidance on consent. I prepared the consultation response submitted by the National Secular Society, which praised the GMC's draft consent guidance, which has since been published largely unchanged from that draft. The headline statement that shared decision-making and consent are fundamental to good medical practice is music to the ears. The guidance is unapologetically patient-focused, warning about vulnerable patients and that treatment must only be prescribed when satisfied that it serves the patient's needs. In our consultation response, we alerted the GMC that this excellent consent guidance would nevertheless be in conflict with their existing guidance on personal beliefs and medical practice, and in particular in conflict with the section on procedures provided for mainly religious or cultural reasons. That's a section that you might have expected to focus on informed choices that competent adults might make on the basis of their faith or culture. Instead, these are the opening words. If patients, brackets, or those with parental responsibility for them, close brackets, ask for a procedure, comma, such as circumcision of male children, comma, for mainly religious or cultural reasons, You can see that the GMC immediately shoehorns in non-therapeutic circumcision of children and then concentrates on it for the whole of the section. The GMC is conflating adults-informed decisions with surgery imposed on a non-consenting child who hasn't yet had time to formulate a belief. Doctors, they advise, must proceed on the basis of the best interests of the child and with consent. Here's the rub though. Consideration of the child's best interest, they say, will include the child's and or the parents' cultural, religious or other beliefs and values. So when you take all this in the round, when you consider ritual circumcision, almost exclusively performed on young children in the UK, doctors are encouraged first to note that the GMC has no position, which necessarily means that the GMC itself considers that its usual advice that would otherwise champion children's rights to an open future should not be guaranteed in this exceptional case. And then into the void created by their claim not to have a position, insert parental beliefs as the only possible proxy for doctors to guess a small child's presumed later beliefs, remembering all the while that the usual protections against coercion, acting too quickly or not involving children have been extinguished by the GMC's purported neutrality. That's the castle of sand on which the GMC's best interests argument stands. During my meeting with the GMC in 2010, BMA guidance was referred to and relied on many times. BMA guidance has no statutory weight, but nevertheless, from a medical perspective, not necessarily the trade union perspective, it's traditionally been heavily relied on, often informing government and other bodies. The previous year, I'd already successfully stood to be a BMA representative, which meant being present and able to participate in the debates and votes during the annual 4-day BMA policy forming meeting, and to engage informally with many of the most politically active doctors in the UK. My meeting with the GMC stimulated me to get more active still if I wanted to influence change in the UK medical profession. The aim was to get the BMA debating and passing a relevant policy motion. The agenda for the annual meeting is decided by a committee from all motions submitted by local divisions of the BMA. I live in Shropshire. Since 2010, every single year, a motion in various forms for the BMA to debate this topic has been discussed in Shropshire, agreed by local members and submitted. None have been chosen for debate at the BMA's annual representatives meeting. Meanwhile, I have contributed at that meeting to BMA debates on assisted dying, conversion therapy, libel law, abortion, nothing too controversial there, some of these topics several times. It was apparent to me that ritual circumcision is more controversial than any of the above. Members of the Agenda Committee have since told me that the BMA was actively avoiding debate. Their media department once even tried, unsuccessfully, to stop me being interviewed on the topic by Sky News. It was time to change tack and to work around those motions that had been chosen. In 2013, a motion at the annual reps meeting condemning all forms of FGM was about to be waved through without debate as self-evidently non-controversial, until I submitted an amendment to remove the letter F. The amended motion was neither debated nor passed. Apparently it was too controversial for the BMA even to debate whether all forms of genital mutilation should be condemned. The following year, in 2014, a similar motion condemning FGM was on the main agenda. I was one of 2 BMA representatives called to speak against this motion, which was condemning FGM. I asked, how could anyone speak against a motion condemning all forms of genital mutilation? The answer, of course, was that it wasn't me, but the body of representatives would be if they passed this sex-specific motion. The words of myself and my colleague who spoke against the motion calling for an end to the BMA's sex discrimination did not prevail. We remain the only 2 BMA representatives to have spoken on the floor of the BMA's representatives meeting about ritual male circumcision since at least 2001. The following year, in 2015, the incoming BMA president was Sir Al Ainsley Green, former Commissioner for Children for England. He had a fringe stall at the annual meeting titled Listening to Children. So I popped over to his stall for a friendly chat. There's a theme. Sir Al listened carefully, acknowledged the inconsistencies and asked me to write to him later, so I did. The next day, just before Sir Al's presidential inauguration, there was a motion tabled for debate calling for more protection from harm for all children in communities and for doctors to work with those communities to protect children. Perfect. I was the last representative called to speak in favour of this motion. I asked a rhetorical question. Would BMA representatives support a girl who wanted to be a doctor in the face of her family's expectations that she would be a homemaker darling? Of course they would. No sex discrimination here in the BMA. And I asked them whether we would support a boy who wanted to grow up with his genitals intact, and said of course we should, but we don't. I called for full support of the motion as worded and for the BMA to mean it. But as I walked back to my seat, the chair of the BMA's Medical Ethics Committee stood up and advised my 500 or so colleagues to, quote, disregard Dr. Lempert's interesting comments which are not relevant to this debate. Like me, he also urged support for the motion, which rendered his comments about me somewhat gratuitous. The debate is still available to watch on YouTube. I later asked Dr. John Chisholm why he'd said this. He flushed and told me that some people hadn't liked what I'd said. As a GP himself, it seemed he'd been distracted from the golden rule of safeguarding and was more concerned with not upsetting adults, presumably religious ones, echoes of the GMC's chief rabbi comment. A few months later, though, in early 2016, Sir Al Ainsley Green came up trumps. He copied me into a letter sent by now as BMA president to the chief officers of the BMA, recommending a transparent BMA-wide root and branch review of non-therapeutic circumcision, involving BMA members and representatives. You may guess that that's not what happened. Instead, I was invited in October that year to meet with Dr. John Chisholm and members of his ethics team. I can't talk about the meeting in detail as it was private, as no doubt were Dr. Chisholm's other meetings, presumably with people with different views. I can say that I brought along with me to the meeting 3 fabulous multidisciplinary colleagues. In advance of the meeting, we 4 submitted a detailed joint recommendation document as to how the BMA might bring its existing guidance, the 2006 The Law and Ethics of Male Circumcision, as it was then called, into line with current thinking in medical ethics and the law. At the request of the Ethics Committee, we also sent them lots of evidence. 18 months later, in March 2018, the 4 of us were invited to submit individual responses to their then highly confidential draft BMA non-therapeutic male circumcision toolkit. You've seen details of that. The recommended transparency with the BMA? No, not even with the policy-forming BMA representative body, never mind with the members. We 4 all responded to their draft document, and the BMA toolkit was published in February 2019, largely unchanged from the draft. In 2023, the co-authored paper that I mentioned earlier discussed the inconsistencies and incoherencies of guidance on this topic, using the BMA toolkit as an exemplar of the problems. My 3 co-authors were those who met Dr. Chisholm with me at that meeting. Let me talk about 1 or 2 highlights or lowlights of the BMA toolkit. Like the GMC, the BMA purportedly has no position on circumcision, thereby actively recommending unique suspension of usual guidance. There is one section of the BMA toolkit that bears special attention though, and this is the section on circumcision for medical reasons, for therapeutic purposes. Before the toolkit, the previous, try and follow this because it's extraordinary. The previous 2006 BMA guidance had stated that for medical circumcision, doctors must always take the most effective and least invasive option. They actually said in literally as many words, it would be unethical for doctors to circumcise a child for therapeutic reasons where there's a more effective, less invasive option. In our joint document before the 2016 meeting with Dr. Chisholm and his team, we'd commended this wording and we'd pointed out the contradiction to the BMA, i.e., if it was unethical to circumcise when there's a less invasive option, even for a medical problem, then when there's not even a medical problem, how could the BMA possibly claim to sit on the fence? The BMA's response to this contradiction is illustrative. This is what the toolkit looks like today. The words in blue are the new words the BMA inserted in 2019. Into the section on circumcision for medical purposes, the word solely has been introduced, together with an addendum, and there are no relevant social and cultural interests for a solely therapeutic procedure. I challenge anyone to make sense of this section now. Social and cultural interests are not solely therapeutic. The BMA had excellent guidance on therapeutic circumcision, which it has now debased by smuggling in an incoherent justification for non-therapeutic circumcision, all the while still claiming to have no position at all. This deliberately incoherent toolkit, and you can see that it is deliberate, is meant as a practical guide for doctors. The BMA and the GMC present a united front on this topic, claiming no position whilst actively supporting the status quo. As a BMA representative, which I'm not now, I did not have the opportunity to propose one of the Shropshire motions to my colleagues. The barriers described in my recent paper include the lack of transparency of process, the avoidance of open debate, and reluctance to challenge religious practice, which represents an institutional failure to recognise what many consider a serious safeguarding failure that endures in plain sight. And you may ask why I've focused on Judaism, when many Muslims and some Christian groups also subject their children to this practice. Well, it's because the GMC does, and because my main opponents have been Jews who simultaneously see me as Jewish and find me invisible as a non-Jew. And it's because people have told me that they fear speaking out, mainly because they don't want to be seen as or accused of being anti-Semitic. Before I finish, let's return to the political conference I was at 2 months ago. I brought up the elephant in the room, unsurprisingly, and things got interesting. One woman abdicated all parental responsibility and said it was the father who decided these things. She then added that she preferred the look of circumcised penises. I suggested to her that it wasn't a good look for an adult to support the cutting of children's genitals on the basis of sexual attractiveness. She didn't persist. Then the woman opposite spoke, and she embodied what I'd been talking about. She wasn't born Jewish, but had become Jewish when she married, and she then opened up to us all that she had found the ritual circumcision of her 2 sons barbaric and traumatising. I sympathised with her and told her that she was not alone, and there are many parents who deeply regret subjecting their children to this practice. Ritual childhood circumcision is a serious safeguarding concern happening in plain sight. It is discriminatory to deny children only from these cutting communities and only of one sex the usual protections when they would otherwise be safeguarded. The reason for this discrimination appears to be that professional regulators are in thrall to the claims of religious leaders, mainly Jewish, who cry out that their religion itself is under existential threat if an 8-day-old baby's genitals are not ritually cut, usually in the child's new home. The irony, of course, is that existentialism is a branch of philosophy that identifies people as having free will. But as we all know, progress is being made, and with our combined persistence and reminders to keep the safeguarding focus on children, the sooner it'll be that ritual genital cutting will form the basis for another bout of national hand-wringing and will be consigned to a memory of the awful things that people used to do to each other. Thank you very much.